There seems to be no end to our fascination with the Old West. The action, the danger, wicked men and painted women, and most of all, the adventure. The saga of the American West has been familiar to moviegoers for generations. Much of what we know or think we know about the West was learned from old movies like this.
This place ain't big enough for you and me, so you better get rolling. And suppose I don't get rolling, you will, because I got you figured right. You're yellow.
Those movies were made on a set, a row of facades and false fronts like this. No real history ever happened here. The Old West is gone forever, but we can still feel a part of it. I'm Will Rogers, Jr., and in my book, there's no better way to get into the spirit of the West than by exploring ghost towns, and that's what we're going to do. So come on along. Most of what remain as ghost towns started as mining camps. It was the golden promise of riches, often just a rumor and a hole in the ground, that set people out for the untamed West. Suddenly, remote, desolate locations were transformed into bustling camps with names like Bedbug, Freeze-Out, Lump City, and Total Wreck. Just as fast as they rose up, these towns could disappear. When the mines played out, the folks moved on. There was always talk of more riches just over the next mountain. Those boom times lasted only about 60 years, but they had a big impact on the settling of our country. Even though it may seem like ancient history to us now, the bonanza days continued well into the early years of this century. And there's a lot left behind to explore. Hundreds of ghost towns are scattered all over the western states. If you really get into ghost town hunting, you might even uncover a new one. In some cases, there won't be much left. A dump in Death Valley marks the spot where the once thriving town of Skidoo used to stand. In most cases, you'll find it useful to think of ghost towns in terms of three types, according to their condition, accessibility, and so on. Knowing what kind of town you're going to can help you plan ahead and maybe help prevent some problems and surprises. I guess when most people think of ghost towns, the first image that comes to mind is the true ghost, lonely and forgotten. Then there's what you might term a semi-ghost, where a few folks keep the place alive on its past glories. And then there's the tourist town, often well-preserved and full of action. Old Western tourist towns let us experience the flavor of how things once were, kind of like the Old West of the Hollywood movies. But even though some tend to emphasize the glamorous side, They have the advantage of making the Old West really accessible, even to families with small children. This is Calico, outside Barstow, California. This weekend is special. It's the annual Bluegrass Hootenanny.
We're the Calico Wild Bunch, ghost town characters. We come up here on our own just to entertain the people and entertain ourselves. We do it all for fun, and we really enjoy it. And we meet people from all over the world. I've even met people from Russia, Japan, Germany, Scotland, Ireland, Sweden. There was a little girl here yesterday from Sweden. She's traveling around the world. And this was exciting for her.
Most of these professional ghost towns, such as Tombstone or Virginia City, really were mining towns at one time.
They took $86 million worth of silver out of here, and over a period of 16 years. So it really was a boom town.
There's still many, many millions, probably hundreds of millions of dollars worth of silver here. It's a known fact. They've core drilled here a few years ago and discovered some.
You'll find a wide range in the degree of accuracy with which many of these towns have been preserved or recreated.
There's been some modern conveniences added, but because we have so many people here, you can't use outhouses, you know.
In the best of these restoration efforts, care has been taken to bring back the charm and detail of the original structures.
Walter Knott from Knott's Berry Farm fame bought 100 acres and all the original buildings, which were only 5 at that time, and come up here and started restoration in the early spring of '52. Walter Knott, seeing that Calico really needed to be a place preserved, he signed it over to the county of San Bernardino with the stipulation that they in turn declared a historical monument park.
You can discover history firsthand and study artifacts that were part of the daily life for the people who once lived there.
There's a lot of rich history here. It's a very interesting place. It's typical. A lot of people worked hard here. A lot of disappointments. And a few got rich, most of them didn't, and that made it pretty much a typical old mining town.
Far different are the true ghosts. History is stopped for these towns. Often they're isolated and difficult to get to, but the journey is well worth it for those who are dedicated. The payoff is the sense of being in touch with the true pioneering spirit that built the West. Sometimes one lone caretaker will remain. Many times you'll have the whole place to yourself. Just you and the lizards and an occasional coyote. Bodie, California, Elkhorn, Montana, Belmont, Nevada are examples of true ghost towns. Tuckerville, Colorado, is a lonely mountain ghost, totally bypassed by civilization. There's no one left to tell us who the people were who settled in Tuckerville, or what happened while they were there. This small town, isolated in the San Juan Mountains, is not only a true ghost, but a town without a history. You can still find hidden treasures and relics in these isolated locations. Of course, one man's treasure is another man's junk, but you'd be surprised what's still to be found. Coins, tools, bottles, guns, license plates. No telling what might turn up in outhouse pits or in post-hole banks where miners often hid their stash. Now, it's a good idea to check first with the locals to see if the place you're going to explore is on private property or is protected as a historic site. Don't go digging around carting stuff off without permission. When you do get to these true ghost towns, don't expect to see lanterns on the table or bottles on the bar. Usually the tables and the bar won't even be there. Sometimes even the buildings are gone. I've returned to my favorite ghost towns over the years, and they never look the same twice. So take along a camera and plenty of film. A building might not be standing next time. Age, wind, and weather have really taken their toll of these places. And even more than that, vandals. But there are a few people who care enough about the Old West, they're trying to change all that. After a few years exploring the West, Herb Robbins became such a fan of ghost towns that he decided to buy his own. Now he's fulfilling his dream by turning Gold Point, Nevada, into a place he can share with others who are also fascinated by authentic Western history.
A lot of times they ask me what I'm doing out here, and I just tell them I have a love for this area and I'm restoring these buildings because I hate to see them just blow away in the desert. I came across this town about 1978, and I bought 3 little lots here in 1979, and I stayed out here in a tent the first time, and from there I bought the old general store and post office, and a couple years after that I realized that this was what I want to do in life. So I decided to start buying more of the town up and restore something and be known for something. I want to save these towns. This building was built in 1908 as a Horn-Silver town site and telephone building, and the telephone company was only one phone connected to Cooperite 15 miles away. It sat a couple blocks from this position, and it was moved in the 30s up to the top of the hill to use as an assay office for the mines. And about 7 years ago I brought it down to this position here for restoration. And I put the bar in. The red part here came from a bar out of Mina, and the back bar with the mirror came out of the old ghost town of Bodie. I hope someday I'll open a tourist attraction here, have a bed and breakfast in, sell gasoline again, have a general store. If tourists come through, they're my main priority and goal. Take them through a museum and give them a first-class tour of everything. This is the old general store here, Gold Point. The old dry goods shelves, you still have the prices on it, 28 cents, 45, and they just crossed them off, nothing new like today's. And in about 1960 the mines closed, and the last 40 people moved away, and the senator's wife, Ora Mae Wiley, had to think of something else to do with this back room, so she brought in some of the books that she used to read and made a little museum out of here. These are just thrown up. They were temporary at the time, but they're still here. And with my help, these buildings are going to be here for at least another 100 years or so.
The so-called semi-ghost towns somehow manage to cling to life, though the look and feel of these places is a mite different from the glory days. The population may have dropped from tens of thousands to a few dozen folks. They'll probably tell you that theirs is the town that wouldn't die. Often these semi-ghosts are located on highways and survive by supplying services to people passing through. You'll hear talk of reactivating the mines and returning the town to its former stature. Usually it's just talk.
I've had claims for 20 years that every year I go out and I clear a little bit of brush out and I dream about what I possibly get out of it. And owning a gold mine is kind of neat. I had one that when the wife would say she wanted some extra money, I'd say, okay, go get it. It's there in the ground, just dig it out. Mark Twain, I think, called a gold mine a hole in the ground owned by liars. And it's a lot of fun to have one.
Grandest of the semi-ghosts is Goldfield, Nevada. An old dinosaur of a town, it was for a time the largest mining city of them all. Site of the last great gold bonanza, Goldfield was called home by 30,000 people in 1910.
Gold was everywhere. In fact, one carload averaged 600 ounces per ton. There was more gold taken out of Goldfield per ton than any other place in the world to date. And they found gold here right outside of Columbia Mountain in the middle of a sandstorm. And they named their claim the Sandstorm, and that started a stampede of gold miners, dreamers, if you will, pouring into the area. It was fantastic here. Everything just meshed together to make Goldfield one of the greatest gold camps in the world.
The largest and finest building erected was a splendid Goldfield Hotel, which opened its doors with such fanfare that champagne flowed down the steps into Columbia Street. If asked, most folks are willing to recount tales about the one guest who never checked out, the mysterious lady that haunts the Goldfield Hotel.
There's been some weird things happen.
Both of us has had psychics through there time after time, and they always home in on that same area.
I myself heard music and saw people in here. I don't know for sure if I was hallucinating or not.
I don't have an answer for it, but every time you walk in there, you get a shiver.
This many people can't be wrong. There must be something there.
There was trouble amidst the glory, growing unrest between newly organized labor unions and the mine owners. Strikes shut things down. Threats were made to blow up the town. President Teddy Roosevelt eventually had to call in federal troops to keep the peace. Lady Luck continued to look the other way.
Well, the gold, they say, ran out, but I don't think so. 1913, we had a flood. 1923 was a disaster. We had a fire that burned 54 city blocks, and we ran out of water, and the wind got up, and it just wiped out the town, and it really didn't recover.
The place settled into the quiet existence of a classic semi-ghost town, its buildings scattered along Highway 95 between Reno and Las Vegas. Goldfield's future was just as shaky as any other town, with its hopes based on a continuing supply of mineral wealth. But what a record. Total value, $90 million. That'd be over $1.8 billion today.
$2 billion is nothing to sneeze at. And there's still, according to the old timers and the mine promoters, there's still that much more gold in the ground here. But it takes a very complicated method to get out. And labor costs and materials and everything else have made it more difficult. But there's guys still out there trying and digging.
Let's go back to where the story really started, in California's Mother Lode country. And this is what started it all: gold. Gold fever took hold of the country. The 49ers began a mass migration such as the world had never seen. California or bust was their motto, and Ho for California was their theme song.
Ho, boys, ho, to California go. We'll explore the western shore and fill our pockets with a golden ore. It's the finest mine around with a bushel and a peck all over the ground. Then ho, boys, ho, to California go. There's plenty of gold in the world, I'm told, on the banks of the Sacramento.
Gold out there is everywhere and everybody is a millionaire. It's so thick with Jedrick's pick, just picking up chunks as big as our brick.
Then ho, boys, ho, to California go. There's plenty of gold in the world, I'm told, on the banks of the Sacramento. Oh, don't you cry nor heave a sigh, for we'll come back again by and by.
Don't breathe out air nor shed a tear, but patiently wait for a back through deer.
Ho, boys, ho, to California go. There's plenty of gold in the world, I'm told, on the banks of the Sacramento.
The spirit of the gold rush days is still very much alive in the towns along State Highway 49 and the nearby back roads. Fragments of the roaring camps are intermingled with active communities that have an old-time flavor. Those who are really more likely to strike it rich in terms of an abundance of things to see and do are the new 49ers who explore this route. Most of what's left of Coloma, the first boom town, can be found in Gold Discovery Historic Park. Sutter's Mill has been reconstructed and the surrounding buildings preserved. This area is where the legends of the Western outlaws got their start. Black Bart, the gentleman robber, and Joaquin Murrieta, one of the most vicious bad men around. Not to be missed is the annual frog jumping contest in Angels Camp, made famous by Mark Twain's story.
Bring down. Just in the center right now.
Before long, the boom was over, at least for the easy-picking placer miners. Only the hard rock mining companies, with their heavy machinery for digging deep in the earth, continued to survive. So when news came of rich strikes east of the Sierras, another rush was on, and folks retraced the same trails they'd come over a few years before. Now the catchwords were, Bodie or bust. Here's a place that's truly suspended in time. Though hard to get to, you can't do better than Bodie if it's a true ghost town you're looking for. These pictures were shot shortly after Bodie became a California State Historical Park in 1962. Today, it looks pretty much the same. In a unique preservation effort, it's kept in a state of arrested decay. It's not renovated or upgraded, but through subtle care, it's prevented from further deterioration. Traveling to the remote location of Bodie calls for some determination. It's at the end of an unpaved road that winds for many miles through lonesome hills, and often it's unreachable in winter, so check the road conditions before you go. In its heyday, Bodie had 10,000 citizens and produced a total of more than 70 million worth of gold. The place had a reputation of being a bad town. There were more than 60 bars. Notorious characters were reported to live there. The undertaker, also the local furniture maker, was a busy man. They say there was a killing a day. Yep, Bodie had quite a reputation. In fact, the phrase "bad man from Bodie" came to be used to describe outlaws all over the West. Well, in spite of, or perhaps because of, what it was in the past, Bodie is my personal recommendation of a can't-miss experience for any ghost town hunter. Millions of years ago, an inland sea covered the land between the Wasatch Mountains of Utah and the Sierra Nevadas. Geology and climate changed, leaving a vast, rugged landscape that we call the Great Basin. The mines that cropped up throughout this barren land would eventually yield greater riches than those of the mother Lode. As a result, one of the richest concentrations of ghost towns is found in the Great Basin. Far from a ghost, Virginia City relives its colorful past daily. Its location near Reno, Carson City, and Lake Tahoe has given it a prime opportunity to benefit from visitors to the area seeking a frontier experience. It was the largest and wealthiest mining town in the West. Site of the famed Comstock silver lode, Virginia City demonstrates a rich sense of style. Many of the renovated mansions serve as lodgings for tourists. But the destiny of most of Nevada's early mining towns was not as glamorous as Virginia City's. If it weren't for Highway 50, Austin, Nevada, for instance, probably would have dried up and blown away years ago. When silver was discovered in 1862, it appeared that Austin would be Virginia City's heir to fame and fortune. The International Hotel and Cafe was moved piece by piece over 150 miles from Virginia City to Austin. This was a common practice in those days because wood was expensive. Some whole towns were literally carried off over the mountains as migration followed wealth. Stokes Castle, just outside Austin, was a summer house built as a fortification to protect the owner's wealth. From the top of the tower, he could make sure his wagons were safe from desperadoes as ore was transported from the mines. The luck of a prospector who had failed to make his fortune in the Comstock lode changed for the better in Ione, Nevada. The population quickly grew, and stores, restaurants, and barber shops cropped up. A brief 2 years after Ione sprang up, news of a richer strike 50 miles down the road circulated, and the fickle miners and camp followers picked up their belongings and left. The richer strike down the road was Belmont, Nevada. In 1865, the town had a dream of becoming the next Virginia City, but unfortunately, it was just a dream. When it looked like hopes for prosperity in Belmont were going belly up, they picked up the Catholic Church and moved it down the road to deal with a migration of sinners to the town of Manhattan. The grand old Cosmopolitan Music Hall in Belmont was recently pulled down for safety reasons. One more piece of the Old West has disappeared. If you go exploring these old towns, use some caution and common sense when poking around abandoned buildings and old mines. Old floors and steps have a habit of giving way, and you might just surprise a snake or some other creature. Be particularly watchful if you've got small children with you. Dangerous chemicals were often used to extract gold from the ore, so if possible, check with the locals before exploring mines and workings. Rhyolite, a city of golden dreams from the early 20th century. A supreme example of pioneer optimism, Rhyolite was laid out by an engineer on a master plan with impressive stone buildings built to last. But crooked stock schemes and easy credit undermined the town's financial base. People left almost overnight, leaving behind the skeleton of a town that used to be. Some of those that remained lived in bottle houses, not part of the master plan. Each took 50,000 beer bottles, but in a town full of thirsty miners, they were a plentiful building material. A true Wild West experience for dude and cowhand alike is joining a trail ride out of a guest ranch in the area around Wickenburg, Arizona. Ghost town hunting on horseback will take you to Congress, a roaring camp at the turn of the century. Today, it's worth only a brief pause on the trail. The Vulture Mine produced a lot of wealth in its day. They say you can still pick up bits of gold in the main street. Many of the original rock buildings were torn down for their gold content. Now the town is protected by a caretaker, and admission is charged, but don't begrudge paying a small amount. Fees make it possible to protect and maintain Vulture as a true ghost town. Western writer Zane Grey is said to have lived and written for a spell in Vulture. He had a room under the floor of the cantina. Don't imagine he got much sleep. They tell a story about the hanging tree there. You see, it got quite a bit of use. A citizen of Vulture was heard to say, "The limb of that hanging tree ain't so high, but it gets their feet off the ground." You know, the legends of the Old West survive by stories and tall tales, often told around campfires. Many were about those colorful characters, the desert prospectors. For every rascal like Death Valley Scotty or the Lost Dutchman, there was many a lone prospector who set out with a grub stake, a burro, and a dream of riches. Like Orville Ewing. I'll bet he never punched a time clock. Spend a few minutes with him and his companions, and you'll believe the Old West still lives. Seldom seen Slim finally settled down here in Ballarat, near Death Valley, telling stories of a simpler time. Smiley Washburn would talk your ear off, and just might be persuaded to tell you the whereabouts of an old town or lost mine. Tumbleweed Harris, a character right out of a Western movie. He knew some of today's ghost towns when they were in their prime. Most of them are gone now. They were the last of a breed. A few found fortune, most didn't. But by following their dreams, they helped open the way west. Since first staked out as a copper mining center in the 1870s, Jerome has gone through good times and bad. As you can see, the population has declined a bit. Built at a precarious angle on the side of a mountain, the town has continued to slide away ever since an underground dynamite blast in 1925 started the place on its way downhill. The famous traveling jail has slid over 300 feet, even crossing the road. Don't expect any shootouts. It's peaceful here. Old buildings have been turned into museums and gift shops, and the bordello is now a restaurant. Jerome is like many towns all over the West, where enterprising citizens are preserving our pioneer heritage. Fortune smiled on the little town of Oatman, Arizona, about the time Rhyolite disappeared into history. One of the last mining towns to survive, gold was produced here right up to the early 1940s, when the government shut down the mines during the Second World War. Still, it was an oasis for travelers crossing the desert on Route 66. But the place was almost forgotten when a new highway bypassed Oatman in the early 1950s. Oatman has had its day in the spotlight. Frequently linked with Hollywood, the gossip columns reported that Clark Gable and Carole Lombard stopped at the Oatman Hotel on their honeymoon. Several films have used the town as an authentic location. These scenes were made shortly after Oatman was transformed into Gold City for the film How the West Was Won. The few residents take pride in a hardy spirit, a frontier mixture of grit and tenacity. Their town offers a feel of the Old West, with weekend gunfights and friendly burros, and there's even been a revival of mining activity in the area. If there ever was a town that wouldn't die, I guess it'd be Oatman. The fate of many other settlements across the West has not been as favorable. Gold Road, a few miles from Oatman, was also forced to close down its mining operation during World War II. In an effort to avoid paying taxes on what was now an unprofitable investment, the owners themselves actually destroyed much of the town. Adobe structures, stripped of their roofs, gradually turned to mud with each rainfall. A trip by four-wheel drive up Surprise Canyon in the Panamint Mountains will take you to the ruins of a town that met an ironic fate. Panamint City was so rough that Wells Fargo refused to go there. The main street once stretched a mile up the canyon. This was Death Valley's first boom town. But it was water, too much water, that did it in. A flash flood brought a wall of water which swept the town 5,000 feet down into the valley below. Needless to say, the town never recovered. This is Rawhide, a roughshod city that's all but disappeared from the pages of history. These scenes were some of the last shots taken of this historic relic of Nevada's 20th century gold bonanza. A thoughtless vandal destroyed the last few buildings with some spare dynamite just to watch them explode. Even before that, it was fire and the lack of water that sealed Rawhide's fate.
Water was a scarce commodity in much of the desert west, and Rawhide was certainly no exception. They say that the cost of a bath was $5, and all that got you was 2 inches of water in a big tub. But thirsty miners knew their priorities. After one fire, they helped rebuild a new saloon in 5 days. But the day of reckoning came for Rawhide in September 1908, when flames engulfed the town.
These remarkable news photos catch the horror of the devastation on that terrible day. Of all the hardships faced by the people of these rugged towns, it was fire that was the most dreaded. Wood structures and tents were usually squeezed tightly together. With water supplies so limited, especially in the desert towns, there was no other force against which they were so helpless. Hardly any escaped the tragedy of fire. Some were burned and rebuilt 2 or 3 times.
Many of the best remaining ghost towns were spared because they were built of brick or stone. The town of Shasta is an example. A prosperous trading center for the Northern California mines, the place burned to the ground time and time again. The story goes that the mayor, stepping through the charred remains, declared that henceforth every building on Main Street would have to be built of brick. Shasta would last till kingdom come, or he'd know the reason why. Well, sir, Shasta rose from the ashes with the longest brick street in the state, even besting San Francisco. And today, that street still stands on State Highway 299, a monument to a lot of good masons and a very determined mayor.
In spite of financial ruin, of disasters, man-made and natural, it seems somehow reassuring that so many towns and their citizen dreamers continued to survive. Which brings us back to Goldfield, where residents, old-timers and newcomers alike, are working to bring back a glorious past. The fortune of the town is now tied to the successful reopening of one building, the grand old Goldfield Hotel.
This is a historical restoration, so we're having to build a new storefront to close this in like it was originally. So now we're having to replace these stairs, but we took pictures, we have to make them look just like they did before. These doors, we're going to repair these doors. They're good enough to keep. You have guidelines from the Parks Department and the Historical Society that you have to follow, and you have to tell them before you start the project what exactly you're going to be doing. The largest thing was getting the building up to seismic codes. We spent 13 months putting 1,500 yards of concrete and about 200 ton of steel in this building. We're not, a lot of people go in and they'll clean the stone up. We're not. We're leaving it with the original texture to it, that what the age of 80 years has done to it. Same way with the brick. We're not cleaning the brick or any of that. Majority of them are craftsmen. They're living in the middle of nowhere in order to work on this job. They really enjoy the restoration.
Everything is changing. Attitudes are changing. The old guard is actually looking forward to what's happening here. The economy is hoping to live with the hotel. We've got 7 antique stores where we had none. We have a gas station that's actually open now. We have restaurants and we have had none. We have a towing service, a bus line now. Western Union's here. We don't have a bank yet, but we're working on that.
Now, if you've decided it's time to turn off the TV and head out to where these stories took place, a little advanced planning will make your trip a mite easier. The more remote and hard to find a place is, the better prepared you'll have to be.
You'll need a good road map and in some cases a topographical map. These maps show a very small area in great detail and indicate what kind of terrain to expect. Jeep trails, wells, mines, and buildings are shown on topo maps. They can be found at any travel and camping store or contact the U.S. Geologic Survey in Denver for information.
Some of the basics that you just cannot get along without would be water, food, extra blanket or two in case you get stuck and you have to spend the night out in your vehicle, a come-along and chain in case your four-wheel drive does not have a winch on it, a shovel, a spare tire that is full, a can of Fix-A-Flat in case you run over a cactus while going out and boonie crashing, a jack. A lot of times people don't have jacks in their cars, just to change a tire or to be able to get yourself up out of a little bit of a sand dune and put something underneath it, a piece of wood or gunny sack to be able to get yourself out. I wouldn't go out with anything less than that. I love these areas so much, and I hate to see them destroyed because of all the places I've been to. And I'm looking at 200 or 300 ghost towns I've been to, and when I've gone back to them, things are gone or torn down or burnt down, and I hate to see that happen to this town, to Gold Point. So I'm going to buy up as much as I can, if not the whole thing, restore it to what it used to be originally, and have a bed and breakfast in and tourist attraction. But just if it just stayed this way for the rest of my life and longer, I'd be happy.
When you come upon one of those places from another time, maybe, if just for a little while, you'll get in touch with the spirit of the West, the real West. It's still there for those who search for it. I'm Will Rogers, Jr.